Ted Patrick, 1976, kidnapped the bride on her wedding day on July 4, 1976, in Madison Square Garden, New York City, exactly 200 years after America declared independence from British rule. A 22-year-old woman named Susan Elizabeth Hartley stood in a white wedding dress she'd never chosen, next to a man she'd met exactly 3 times, preparing to marry him in a ceremony involving 1,801 other couples, all chosen by a Korean religious leader who claimed to be the Messiah. Her parents, Robert and Margaret Hartley, sat in the audience 17 rows back, watching their only daughter disappear into a mass wedding orchestrated by Reverend Sun Myung Moon and his Unification Church. They'd traveled from their home in Columbus, Ohio, begging for an invitation to witness what the Moonies called a holy blessing ceremony. They'd been denied entry 3 times before finally being allowed to attend as guests, with strict instructions not to approach their daughter or cause disruption. But sitting next to Robert Hartley, wearing a suit that concealed a body still built like the college linebacker he'd been 30 years earlier, was a man named Ted Patrick. And Ted Patrick had not come to New York to witness a wedding. He'd come to stop one, by any means necessary. What happened in the following 72 hours would become one of the most controversial deprogramming cases in American history. A bride kidnapped from her own wedding reception, a family torn between love and legality, a deprogrammer pushed to the absolute limits of his methods, and a young woman caught between 2 identities, 2 futures, 2 versions of truth, forced to choose which one was real in a locked hotel room while police searched the city for her. The New York Police Department would later call it kidnapping, assault, and unlawful imprisonment. The Unification Church would call it religious persecution and satanic intervention. Robert and Margaret Hartley would call it the only choice they had left, and Susan Elizabeth Hartley, depending on which day you asked her, would call it either her rescue or her violation, her salvation or her trauma, the best thing or the worst thing that ever happened to her. But the reason behind the wedding day kidnapping wasn't love, wasn't even desperation, wasn't religion or money or hatred of the Moonies themselves. It was something more primal. It was a father looking at his daughter in a white wedding dress, marrying a stranger chosen by a cult leader, and understanding with perfect clarity that if he didn't act in the next 6 hours, he would lose her forever. That after the wedding, after the consummation ceremony the Moonies required, where Reverend Moon would personally oversee the sexual union to ensure spiritual purity, after Susan became legally bound to a man she didn't love in a marriage she'd been programmed to want, there would be no deprogramming, no rescue, no second chance. The wedding was the point of no return, and Ted Patrick had built a career on intervening before people reached points of no return. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme psychological manipulation, wedding day kidnapping, family betrayal, physical restraint, forced deprogramming, sexual coercion by cult leadership, and the question of whether saving someone from making the worst decision of their life justifies destroying what they believe is the best decision of their life. New York City in July 1976 was a city celebrating and simultaneously falling apart. The Bicentennial had brought tall ships to the harbor, fireworks over the Statue of Liberty, and a sense of patriotic renewal that tried desperately to cover the reality of a city on the edge of bankruptcy. The previous year, President Ford had essentially told New York to drop dead when the city begged for federal bailout money. Crime was skyrocketing. The subways were covered in graffiti. Times Square was a nightmare of porn theaters and drug dealers, but on July 4, 1976, none of that mattered. America was 200 years old, and New York City was the center of the celebration. 2 million people packed into Manhattan to watch the tall ships parade up the Hudson River. Fireworks were planned for that evening that would be visible from all 5 boroughs. And at Madison Square Garden, the Unification Church had rented the arena for what Reverend Sun Myung Moon called the most spiritually significant event in human history since the crucifixion of Christ. 1,802 couples, matched by Reverend Moon himself based on spiritual compatibility he claimed to discern through prayer and divine guidance, would be married simultaneously in what the Moonies called a holy blessing ceremony. The number wasn't random. Moon had chosen 1802 because it corresponded to some numerological significance in unification theology that only members understood and that seemed designed specifically to sound mystical and profound. The couples had been matched weeks earlier. Some had met their partners months ago. Some had met them for the first time at the pre-wedding workshop 3 days before the ceremony. Some were American citizens marrying other Americans. Some were international matches, Americans paired with Japanese or Korean or European members, creating what Moon called the foundation for world peace through international holy families. The average age of the brides was 23. The average age of the grooms was 25. Most had been members of the Unification Church for between 18 months and 4 years. Most had surrendered their previous lives, their careers, their families, their identities, to become full-time members of what they genuinely believed was the one true religion destined to create heaven on earth. And most of their families watched in horror as their children married strangers, in a ceremony that looked more like a cult ritual than a wedding. Susan Elizabeth Hartley was 22 years old in July 1976, the day she was supposed to marry a man named Kenji Tanaka, in a ceremony she'd been taught to believe was the most spiritually significant moment of her life. She stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, 117 pounds, significantly thinner than the 135 pounds she'd weighed 2 years earlier before joining the Unification Church. Her hair, which had been long and auburn before recruitment, was now cut short in the style Reverend Moon preferred for blessed wives, practical and modest. Her eyes, which her mother always said sparkled with intelligence and mischief, now had the particular flatness that comes from 2 years of sleep deprivation, repetitive indoctrination, and surrendering critical thinking. On her right collarbone, a scar in the shape of a small hook, legacy of a sledding accident when she was 12 years old. She'd crashed into a fence, and a piece of wire had caught her collarbone and torn a gash that required 8 stitches. The scar was hidden by her wedding dress, a modest white gown with long sleeves and a high neckline that covered everything the Unification Church considered immodest, which was essentially everything. Before the Moonies, Susan Elizabeth Hartley had been a psychology major at Ohio State University. She'd graduated in 1974 with honors, planning to attend graduate school and become a clinical psychologist. She'd been smart, ambitious, skeptical of authority, the kind of young woman who questioned everything and believed in science and evidence over faith and tradition. Her parents, Robert and Margaret Hartley, had been proud of her in ways they struggled to articulate. Robert was a high school chemistry teacher, 51 years old, who'd spent his career trying to teach teenagers that the world made sense if you understood the rules governing it. Margaret was a librarian, 49 years old, who believed that knowledge and literacy were the foundations of a good life. They'd raised Susan to think critically, to question assumptions, to never accept something as true just because someone in authority said it was. Which made what happened in the fall of 1974 all the more devastating. Susan had graduated in June 1974, planned to take a gap year before graduate school, travel, work, figure out exactly what kind of psychology she wanted to specialize in. In September, she'd moved to San Francisco, attracted by the counterculture, the freedom, the sense that California was where young people went to reinvent themselves. She'd gotten a job waitressing at a vegetarian restaurant in the Haight-Ashbury district. Rented a studio apartment with 2 roommates. Spent her free time exploring the city, going to concerts, smoking marijuana occasionally, doing exactly what thousands of other recent college graduates were doing in 1974. On October 12, 1974, at approximately 3:47 in the afternoon, Susan was walking through Golden Gate Park when she encountered a group of young people having a picnic. They looked happy, laughing, playing guitar, and when they saw Susan walking past, one of them, a woman maybe 25 years old with a bright smile, invited her to join them. Susan, who'd been feeling lonely in a new city where she didn't know anyone, said yes. The group introduced themselves as members of the Creative Community Project, an organization dedicated to creating world peace through intercultural understanding and volunteer service. They were having a workshop that weekend at a retreat center in Marin County, learning about global issues and discussing solutions. Would Susan like to come? It was free, included meals and lodging, and would be a great way to meet people and learn about making a difference in the world. Susan Elizabeth Hartley, 22 years old, psychology graduate, daughter of a chemistry teacher and a librarian, said yes. She had no idea that the Creative Community Project was a front organization for the Unification Church, had no idea that the weekend workshop was the first stage of a recruitment process perfected over years of practice, had no idea that by the time she left that retreat center, 3 days later, she would be convinced that Reverend Sun Myung Moon was the Messiah and that her purpose in life was to dedicate everything to building his kingdom on earth. The Unification Church, known to most Americans as the Moonies, had been founded in Korea in 1954 by Sun Myung Moon, a businessman and religious leader who claimed to have received a vision from Jesus Christ, instructing him to complete the work Jesus had failed to accomplish. According to Moon's theology, Jesus had succeeded spiritually but failed physically because he'd been crucified before he could marry and create a perfect family. Moon claimed he was the second Messiah, sent to earth to create the perfect family, and through it restore humanity to the sinless state Adam and Eve had enjoyed before the fall. The theology was complicated, drawn from Christianity, Korean shamanism, anti-communist political philosophy, and Moon's own revelations. But the recruitment techniques were simple and devastatingly effective. Love bombing, sleep deprivation, repetitive lectures that wore down critical thinking, social pressure from a group of true believers, isolation from family and friends who might question what was happening. By 1976, the Unification Church had an estimated 30,000 members in America, most of them young people between 18 and 28 who joined during the previous 5 years as the movement exploded across college campuses and major cities. Moon had moved his headquarters to New York in 1971, sensing that America, the most powerful country in the world, was the key to his plan for global spiritual dominance. The Moonies recruited primarily through front organizations with names that sounded appealing to idealistic young people. The Creative Community Project, the Collegiate Association for the Research of Principles, the International One World Crusade. These groups would invite people to free dinners, workshops, retreats. Only after someone had been attending for days or weeks would they reveal the connection to Reverend Moon and the Unification Church. By then, it was often too late. The person had been love-bombed into believing this group of friendly, accepting, purpose-driven people was the family they'd been searching for, had been sleep-deprived and lecture-saturated to the point where critical thinking felt difficult and the group's explanations felt true, had been isolated from outside influences long enough that returning to normal life felt more frightening than staying. Susan Hartley attended the weekend workshop in October 1974, was impressed by the intelligence and dedication of the members, was moved by the lectures about creating world peace and solving humanity's problems through love and spiritual development, was convinced to attend another workshop the following weekend, then a week-long workshop, then a 21-day training program. By December 1974, Susan had moved into a Unification Church Center in Oakland, surrendered her possessions and her savings, and become a full-time member. She'd called her parents to explain that she'd found her life's purpose, that she was part of a movement to create heaven on earth, that Reverend Moon was the Messiah, and she was honored to dedicate her life to his mission. Robert and Margaret Hartley were devastated. Flew to San Francisco to talk to their daughter, found her living in a crowded house with 20 other members, sleeping 4 hours a night, spending 12 hours a day fundraising on the streets, speaking in the particular monotone that cult members develop when they've repeated the same script so many times they sound robotic. They tried to convince her to come home, tried to reason with her, tried to remind her of her plans for graduate school, her dreams of becoming a psychologist, her skeptical nature that had always questioned authority. Susan responded with scripted phrases about Satan trying to tempt her away from her true purpose, about her parents being trapped in fallen nature, about how she'd finally found truth and meaning. Robert and Margaret returned to Ohio, understanding they'd lost their daughter to something they didn't fully understand and couldn't fight through conventional means. For 18 months, they tried everything. Called Susan weekly, She'd talk for 5 minutes before saying she had to go, needed to return to her mission. Sent letters, most went unanswered. Contacted cult awareness organizations, who explained that there was nothing legal they could do unless Susan wanted help leaving. Contacted lawyers, who confirmed that Susan was a legal adult making her own choices, however misguided those choices seemed. In March 1976, Susan called home with news. She was being blessed. Reverend Moon had matched her with a Japanese member named Kenji Tanaka. They would marry in July in New York City at the largest blessing ceremony in church history. Susan was honored, humbled, grateful to True Father Moon for choosing her eternal spouse based on spiritual compatibility that ensured their marriage would create a sinless family line. Margaret Hartley cried for 3 days after that phone call. Robert Hartley started researching deprogrammers. He found articles about Ted Patrick. Read Patrick's book, Let Our Children Go, that detailed his methods, his successes, his arrests, his absolute conviction that kidnapping and deprogramming cult members was justified because the alternative was watching them destroy their lives. Robert called the number listed in the back of the book, explained the situation with Susan, explained that she was getting married in 4 months to a stranger chosen by Sun Myung Moon. Ted Patrick listened carefully. Then he asked the question that would define everything that followed. Do you want your daughter back, or do you want to respect her choices? Robert didn't hesitate. I want my daughter back. Then we need to act before the wedding, Ted said. After marriage, deprogramming becomes significantly harder. The commitment deepens, the investment increases, the identity as a blessed wife becomes too integrated to break easily. If we're going to do this, we do it on the wedding day. Before the consummation ceremony, before the legal marriage is finalized, you want to kidnap her from her own wedding? Robert asked. I want to give her a choice before she makes a decision she can't undo, Ted said. The wedding isn't her choice, it's Moon's choice. She's been programmed to believe it's what she wants. Our job is to deprogram her before it's too late. The plan Ted Patrick designed was simultaneously simple and insane. They would attend the wedding, Robert and Margaret as invited family guests. Ted would attend under a false name as a family friend. They'd watch the ceremony, couldn't disrupt it because security was too tight and causing a scene would get them arrested before they could grab Susan. But after the ceremony, during the reception when couples mingled with family members, they'd make their move. Robert would approach Susan, ask to speak with her privately, play the emotional father who just wanted a moment with his daughter on her wedding day. When they were away from the main reception area, Ted and a hired assistant would join them. They'd escort Susan, using force if necessary, to a van waiting outside Madison Square Garden, drive immediately out of New York City to a rented house in rural Pennsylvania, 2 hours away. Spend the next 72 hours deprogramming her before she had to make the decision of whether to return to her new husband or return to her family. The risks were enormous. Kidnapping charges, assault charges, international incident if Kenji Tanaka's family pressed charges, civil suit from the Unification Church, and the possibility that Susan would never forgive them, that the deprogramming would fail, that they'd traumatize their daughter and lose her anyway. But Robert and Margaret Hartley had reached the point where any action felt better than watching their daughter marry a stranger in a mass wedding orchestrated by a cult leader who claimed to be the Messiah. They paid Ted Patrick $22,000, their entire retirement savings, every penny they'd managed to save over 30 years of teaching and working in libraries. Ted took the money and promised nothing except that he would try his hardest to bring their daughter back. On the morning of July 4, 1976, Ted Patrick woke in a hotel room in Manhattan at 5:15, made instant coffee in the room's small coffee maker, did 50 push-ups and 50 sit-ups, a scaled-down version of his normal routine, showered, dressed in the suit he'd wear to the wedding, checked the fake ID one more time. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what he was about to do. Ted Patrick had deprogrammed over 400 people by July 1976, had been arrested 21 times, had spent short stints in jail on 3 occasions, had been sued by cults, threatened by members, followed by private investigators, labeled a criminal and a hero depending on who you asked. But he'd never kidnapped someone from their wedding before, never interrupted a ceremony this public, this significant, this surrounded by security and witnesses and legal complexity. The wedding would make it harder. Susan would feel betrayed on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The trauma would be deeper, the deprogramming would be more difficult. But Ted also knew that if he didn't act today, Susan Elizabeth Hartley would consummate her marriage to Kenji Tanaka in a ceremony the Moonies required, where Reverend Moon would literally watch couples have sex to ensure the marriage was spiritually valid. After that, the psychological barriers to leaving would be nearly insurmountable. The shame, the investment, the binding to another person who was also programmed, it would all combine to make deprogramming almost impossible. Today was the last chance, and Ted Patrick had built a career on last chances. The holy blessing ceremony began at 11 in the morning. 1,802 couples filed into Madison Square Garden in perfect formation, brides on one side, grooms on the other. They'd been training for this moment for weeks, practicing the synchronized movements, the responses, the prayers. Everything had to be perfect because this ceremony was being televised, broadcast to Unification Church centers around the world, documented as proof that Reverend Moon was creating the kingdom of heaven on earth. Susan Elizabeth Hartley walked down the aisle in Section B, row 47. Her wedding dress had been provided by the church, identical to every other bride's dress except for minor alterations for fit. She carried a small bouquet of white roses. Her face showed no expression, the carefully neutral look that Moonies cultivated when performing public ceremonies. Walking 17 rows behind her, barely visible in the crowd of brides, was a young woman named Michelle Park, Susan's spiritual mother in the church, responsible for ensuring Susan stayed focused and committed. Michelle would stay close to Susan throughout the reception, standard procedure to prevent family members from pulling blessed members aside and attempting to undermine their faith. Kenji Tanaka stood in Section A, row 47, directly across from Susan. He was 26 years old, Japanese, had been a Unification Church member for 4 years. He'd joined in Tokyo, been sent to America as a missionary, and had been matched to Susan by Reverend Moon 3 months earlier. They'd met twice before today, both times in supervised group settings, where personal conversation was discouraged in favor of discussion about their shared spiritual mission. Kenji knew almost nothing about Susan except what he'd been told by church leaders. She was intelligent, dedicated, from a good family who hadn't yet accepted True Father's teaching but would in time. She would be a good spiritual wife who would help him create a sinless family lineage that would contribute to the restoration of humanity. Susan knew similarly little about Kenji. He was hard-working, faithful, had been chosen by True Father based on spiritual compatibility that transcended surface understanding. Their marriage wasn't based on romantic love, which the Moonies taught was selfish and fallen. It was based on true love, the sacrificial, God-centered love that put mission above personal feelings. From row 17, Robert and Margaret Hartley watched their daughter stand with 1,801 other couples waiting to be married to strangers. Margaret was crying silently, tears running down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. Robert sat rigid, hands clenched, jaw tight, looking at his daughter and the man she was about to marry, and feeling a rage so pure it made his vision narrow. Ted Patrick sat 3 seats away from Robert, watching everything with the focused attention of someone who'd studied cult ceremonies extensively and understood the psychology underlying every element, the synchronized movements that reinforced conformity, the mass nature of the ceremony that made individual resistance feel impossible. The presence of Reverend Moon on his throne, the physical embodiment of the authority members had surrendered to. The ceremony lasted 3 hours, prayers in Korean that most attendees didn't understand, speeches from Moon about the spiritual significance of creating blessed families. The actual marriage vows, delivered simultaneously by all 1,802 couples in a wave of voices that sounded more like chanting than individual promises. The blessing itself, where Moon and his wife stood and performed a ritual that involved holy water and specific hand movements while the couples bowed in unison. Then it was done. The couples were married. 1,802 individuals had just legally bound themselves to strangers chosen by a cult leader, in a ceremony that, despite its strangeness, was legally valid in New York State. The reception began at 2:30 in the afternoon. The floor of Madison Square Garden was reorganized, tables and chairs replacing the rows of seated couples. Food was served, simple vegetarian dishes that followed Mooney dietary restrictions. Couples sat with their new spouses, making awkward conversation, trying to get to know the person they'd just married. Family members were allowed to approach and congratulate the newlyweds, but always under supervision, always with church members nearby to ensure no one said anything that might disturb the blessed couple's spiritual focus. At 3:17, Robert Hartley approached his daughter's table. Susan sat with Kenji, who was trying to communicate despite his limited English and her limited Japanese. Michelle Park sat 2 seats away, watching the conversation carefully. "Susan," Robert said. His voice cracked. "Congratulations." Susan looked up at her father. Her expression was carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "Thank you, Father. I'm honored that you and Mother came." "Can we talk?" Robert asked. "Just for a few minutes? I'd like to speak with my daughter on her wedding day." Michelle Park started to object. "Susan needs to stay with her husband. They're building their foundation." "5 minutes," Robert said. "Please. I'm her father." Susan looked at Kenji, who nodded. He didn't understand the English conversation fully, but understood that Susan's father wanted to speak with her. Susan stood. Michelle immediately stood as well, intending to accompany them. "Just us," Robert said firmly. "Family conversation." "I'll need to come," Michelle insisted. "Susan is a blessed wife now. She needs spiritual protection." "No," Susan said quietly. "It's okay. 5 minutes with my parents won't hurt." Michelle looked uncertain, but didn't argue further. Susan followed her father away from the reception area toward a hallway that led to the arena's back corridors. Margaret Hartley joined them, walking close to her daughter, reaching for her hand. Susan pulled her hand away gently. "Mother, please. Physical affection creates emotional attachment that interferes with my spiritual focus." They walked down the hallway, Robert leading, Susan following, Margaret beside her. At the end of the hallway, near a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," 2 men waited. One was Ted Patrick, the other was Marcus Webb, Ted's assistant, who'd helped with previous deprogrammings. Susan saw them and immediately understood. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth to scream. Ted Patrick moved fast, hand covering her mouth, other arm around her waist, lifting her off her feet. Marcus opened the door. They moved through it quickly, Susan struggling, trying to scream through Ted's hand, kicking at his shins. "Let me go," her voice was muffled. "This is kidnapping. Help! Someone help!" But the service corridor was empty, and the reception noise covered her screams. They reached an exit that led to the loading dock behind Madison Square Garden. A white van was waiting, engine running. They pulled Susan into the van. Robert and Margaret climbed in after her. Marcus secured the door. Ted kept his hand over Susan's mouth. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said quietly, "but we're not letting you throw your life away." The van pulled away from Madison Square Garden at 3:23, 6 minutes after Robert Hartley had asked to speak with his daughter. Behind them, in the reception hall, Michelle Park was starting to realize something was wrong. Kenji Tanaka sat at the table, wondering why his new wife was taking so long to return. And Unification Church security was about to discover that a bride had been kidnapped from her own wedding. The drive from Manhattan to the rented house in rural Pennsylvania took 2 hours and 17 minutes. For the first hour, Susan screamed, called her parents traitors, called Ted Patrick Satan, called everyone in the van servants of the fallen world, trying to prevent her from fulfilling her divine mission. She struggled against the restraints Marcus had put on her wrists, kicked at the van walls, demanded to be returned to her husband. "You don't have a husband," Robert said. His voice was tired, defeated, the voice of a man who'd just kidnapped his own daughter and wasn't sure if he'd done the right thing. "You have a stranger Moon assigned to you." Kenji is my eternal spouse, Susan screamed, chosen by true father based on spiritual compatibility. You met him twice, Margaret said quietly. Twice, Susan. How can you marry someone you've met twice? True love transcends physical knowledge. Susan was crying now, furious tears. You don't understand. You're blind to spiritual reality. You're destroying my eternal salvation. By the second hour, Susan had exhausted herself. She sat in the back of the van, still restrained, crying silently, occasionally whispering prayers in Korean that she'd memorized during her time in the church. Ted Patrick sat across from her, watching her with the patient intensity of someone who'd seen this before, who knew that the first hours were the worst, that the programming would fight back hard before it began to break. The house in Pennsylvania was a 2-story farmhouse surrounded by fields, no neighbors within sight, accessible only by a long dirt driveway. Ted had rented it for 1 week under a false name, paid cash, told the owner he needed a quiet place for a family reunion. The owner hadn't asked questions. They arrived at 5:40, pulled Susan out of the van. She tried to run, made it maybe 10 steps before Marcus caught her and carried her inside. The main room had been prepared, mattress on the floor, heavy curtains over windows, a bathroom with the lock removed so Susan couldn't barricade herself inside, food and water, nothing else. Ted removed the restraints. Susan immediately ran for the door. Robert caught her, held her while she struggled and screamed. Eventually she tired again, collapsed on the mattress, pulled her wedding dress around her like armor. "I hate you," she said to her parents. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I will never forgive you for this." "I know," Robert said, "and I'll live with that if it means you get your life back." The deprogramming of Susan Elizabeth Hartley began with a single question from Ted Patrick. "Why did you want to marry Kenji?" Susan looked at him with pure hatred. "Because True Father matched us. Because it's God's will. Because creating a blessed family is my mission. Did you love him?" "Love?" Susan's voice was contemptuous. "Romantic love is selfish, fallen. Our marriage is based on true love, sacrificial love that serves God's providence." "So you didn't love him," Ted confirmed. "You married a man you didn't love because Moon told you to." "I married my eternal spouse because True Father sees spiritual compatibility that transcends physical attraction." Ted nodded. "Okay. Then explain to me why a Messiah needs to choose who you marry. If God wants you married to Kenji, why doesn't God tell you directly? Why do you need Moon to tell you what God wants?" Susan's face did something complicated, a flicker of confusion, quickly suppressed. Because True Father has a direct relationship with God, he receives revelation. We follow his guidance because he sees what we can't see. "So you're saying you can't hear God yourself?" Ted pressed. "You need Moon to hear God for you? We're fallen. Our spiritual senses are damaged. True Father is the Lord of the Second Advent. He restores our connection to God." Ted leaned forward. "Susan, I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. I'm going to ask you to think about what you just said. Really think about it. You graduated with honors in psychology. You understand how the human mind works. So think about this. If someone convinced you that you can't trust your own perceptions, your own judgment, your own connection to truth, and that you need them to tell you what's real, what would you call that?" Susan was silent. "Persuasion?" Ted suggested. "Teaching? Guidance?" Ted paused. "Or would you call it manipulation? Mind control? Brainwashing?" "You're Satan," Susan whispered, "testing my faith." "Maybe," Ted said. "Or maybe I'm asking you questions that Moon doesn't want you to think about." The first night was brutal. Susan refused to engage beyond repeating memorized phrases from Unification theology, refused to eat the food Margaret offered because it hadn't been blessed by true parents and was therefore spiritually contaminated, refused to sleep because she needed to pray for liberation from this satanic captivity. Robert and Margaret took turns sitting with her, trying to reach some part of their daughter that still existed beneath the programming. "Remember when you were 8, Margaret said at one point, and you wanted to be a marine biologist? You made us take you to the aquarium every weekend for 6 months. You knew the name of every fish in the tropical section. Material childhood memories are meaningless, Susan said. My spiritual life began when I met True Father's teaching. But they're your memories, Margaret insisted. Your experiences. How can they be meaningless? Because I was spiritually dead before the church, Susan said. Now I'm alive. You're trying to kill me again. By morning of the second day, 24 hours after the kidnapping, Susan had worn herself out. She'd cried, screamed, prayed, refused all attempts at conversation, but exhaustion was catching up. She hadn't slept, had barely eaten. And the absence of the group reinforcement she'd relied on for 2 years was creating cracks in the armor. Ted Patrick had seen this before. The first day, the programming fought back hard. The second day, exhaustion lowered defenses. The third day, if the deprogrammer had done everything right, breakthrough became possible. Why did you join the Moonies? Ted asked on the morning of day 2. I didn't join a cult, Susan said. I found truth. Okay, Ted said. But why? What were you looking for that the Unification Church provided? Susan was silent for a long time. Then, quietly, meaning, purpose, a way to make a difference. And you couldn't find that in psychology? Ted asked. In becoming a therapist who helps people? Individual therapy doesn't change the world, Susan said. True Father's providence changes everything, creates heaven on earth, solves all of humanity's problems. And you believe that? Ted asked. Really believe it? That moon is going to solve all of humanity's problems? Susan's face flickered, a moment of doubt, quickly suppressed. Yes, I believe it. Then why hasn't he? Ted pressed. Moon's been teaching for over 20 years. Where's heaven on earth? Where's world peace? What's actually changed except Moon getting richer and more powerful? You don't understand the providence, Susan said. It takes time. Generations. How convenient, Ted said. The promised paradise is always just out of reach. Always one more donation away. One more sacrifice. One more blessed marriage. When does it end, Susan? When do you get to live your own life? This is my life, Susan insisted, but her voice cracked. By afternoon of day 2, Susan accepted food. Ate a sandwich Margaret made, drank water. She was still refusing extended conversation, but had stopped the constant prayers and repetitions of unification doctrine, was sitting quietly, staring at nothing, processing. Robert sat with her, didn't speak, just sat there, being present. Eventually, Susan broke the silence. Why did you do this, Dad? Her voice was small, tired. Why couldn't you just let me be happy? Because you weren't happy, Robert said. You were programmed to think you were happy. There's a difference. How do you know? Susan asked. You don't know what I was feeling. I know you graduated with honors in psychology, and now you're selling flowers on street corners 12 hours a day to fund Moon's organization. I know you had dreams of helping people, and now your dream is to please a Korean businessman who claims he's the Messiah. I know my daughter, and the person I saw at that wedding wasn't her. People change, Susan said. They do, Robert agreed. But this wasn't change, this was erasure. They erased who you were and replaced it with who they wanted you to be. By evening of day 2, 48 hours after the kidnapping, the first real breakthrough happened. Susan was looking at photographs Margaret had brought, pictures from Susan's childhood, her time at Ohio State, her graduation. In one photo, Susan was laughing with friends at her 21st birthday party. She looked alive, joyful, completely present. Who is that person? Margaret asked, pointing to the photo. That's me, Susan said. Before. Before what? Before I found truth. Or before you lost yourself, Margaret suggested gently. Susan stared at the photo. Her hands were shaking. I look happy there, she whispered. You were happy, Margaret said. You had friends, dreams, a future you were excited about. What happened to that Susan? She was living in spiritual darkness, Susan said. But the words sounded hollow. Margaret moved closer to her daughter. Sweetheart, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. When was the last time you laughed? Really laughed, like in that photo. Susan thought about it. Her face contorted. I don't remember. 2 years, Margaret said. 2 years you've been in the Unification Church and I haven't seen you genuinely laugh once. You smile when you're supposed to smile. You express joy when Moon tells you to express joy. But spontaneous laughter, genuine happiness that comes from inside. When was the last time, Susan? Susan started crying, real crying this time, not the programmed tears of someone whose faith is being tested, but the deep grieving tears of someone beginning to realize what they've lost. The third day brought resistance again. Susan woke up furious at herself for the breakthrough of day 2. She'd betrayed True Father, let Satan in, allowed doubt to corrupt her faith. She refused to speak to anyone, spent the morning chanting prayers in Korean, trying to restore the mental barriers that had started to crumble. Ted let her. Didn't push, just maintained presence. By afternoon, Susan's chanting had slowed. She was tired, confused. The certainty that had sustained her for 2 years was fracturing, and nothing was replacing it yet. What happens if I leave? Susan asked Ted suddenly. If I decide you're right, and Moon is wrong, and I've wasted 2 years of my life? What happens to me then? You rebuild, Ted said. You figure out who you want to be now, not who you were before and not who the Moonies made you. You process the trauma. You learn to trust yourself again. You get your life back. What if I can't? Susan's voice was very small. What if they broke something in me that can't be fixed? Then you learn to live with broken pieces, Ted said honestly. But you'll be living your own life with your broken pieces, not Moon's life with his programming. Susan was quiet for a long time. Then, I was supposed to consummate my marriage tonight, after the 3-day ceremony. True Father was going to watch to ensure the blessing was spiritually valid. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was describing something normal. Ted and the Hartleys stared at her in horror. Moon was going to watch you have sex, Robert finally said. To ensure it was done correctly, Susan explained. To bless the union properly. To restore the sexual act to its original purity before the fall. Susan, Margaret said carefully, that's not normal. That's not religious teaching. That's a cult leader exerting sexual control over his followers. No, Susan insisted, but she looked uncertain. It's spiritual. It's restoring what was lost in the Garden of Eden. It's Moon getting sexual gratification from watching young people perform for him, Ted said bluntly. Susan, I've deprogrammed over 400 people. I've seen this pattern in every sex cult. The leader always finds religious justification for sexual control, always claims it's spiritual, and it's always manipulation. Susan's face crumbled. Oh my God, she whispered. Oh my God, I was going to... She curled into herself, wrapped her arms around her knees, rocked back and forth. The dam had finally broken. The next 48 hours, days 4 and 5, were dedicated to processing. Ted guided Susan through examining her recruitment, identifying the love bombing, the sleep deprivation, the thought-stopping techniques, all the mechanisms that had been used to program her. The Hartleys sat with their daughter, while she grieved for the 2 years she'd lost, the marriage she'd almost consummated with a stranger, the identity she'd surrendered. Susan's anger shifted, no longer directed at her family for kidnapping her, but at the Unification Church for manipulating her, at herself for falling for it, at Reverend Moon for claiming to be the Messiah while running what was essentially an authoritarian organization that controlled every aspect of members' lives. But the anger was healthy. It meant Susan was thinking critically again, was recognizing manipulation for what it was reclaiming agency over her own thoughts and choices. On day 6, 96 hours after the kidnapping, Susan Elizabeth Hartley made a decision. I'm not going back, she told her parents. To the church, to Kenji, to any of it. I'm done, are you sure? Ted asked. Because if you leave this house and change your mind, we can't kidnap you again. You're legally an adult. This was our one chance. I'm sure, Susan said. She sounded exhausted but certain. I see it now. What they did to me, what I let them do to me. And I can't go back to that. I don't know who I'm going to be going forward, but I know I'm not going to be Reverend Moon's follower anymore. The legal consequences of kidnapping Susan Elizabeth Hartley from her wedding didn't materialize the way Ted Patrick expected. The Unification Church filed police reports, filed civil suits, demanded prosecution. But Susan, now deprogrammed, refused to cooperate with any investigation, told police she'd gone willingly with her parents, told the church to leave her family alone, announced publicly that she'd been brainwashed and was grateful to her family for intervening. Without a cooperative victim, the criminal case fell apart. The civil suit continued for years but eventually settled for an undisclosed amount. Kenji Tanaka returned to Japan, was matched to another American bride the following year. The Unification Church added Ted Patrick to their list of enemies, added Robert and Margaret Hartley to the list of suppressive persons, and continued their operations. Susan spent the next year in intensive therapy, worked with a psychologist who specialized in cult recovery, processed the trauma of both her time in the Unification Church and the kidnapping itself, because despite being grateful for the intervention, being physically grabbed and restrained by your own family leaves scars. 2 years after the deprogramming, Susan reapplied to graduate school, wrote her application essay about her experience with the Moonies, about the psychology of manipulation and recovery, was accepted to a clinical psychology doctoral program at Northwestern University with a focus on trauma and high control groups. 5 years after the deprogramming, Susan completed her doctorate and started working as a therapist specializing in cult recovery. Used her experience to help others who'd been recruited by high control groups, wrote papers about the Unification Church's recruitment techniques that became required reading in cult psychology courses. 10 years after the deprogramming, Susan married a man named Daniel Rodriguez, a social worker she'd met through professional circles. Daniel knew about her Moonie past. She'd told him on their second date, because hiding trauma doesn't make it go away. Daniel had listened, asked thoughtful questions, told her that who she'd been at 22 didn't define who she was at 32. 15 years after the deprogramming, Susan and Daniel had a daughter named Emma. Susan was fiercely protective in ways her parents recognized, monitored what groups Emma joined, what teachers she trusted, what beliefs she adopted, not to control her, but to make sure nobody manipulated her the way Susan had been manipulated. 20 years after the deprogramming, Susan received news that Reverend Sun Myung Moon had suffered a mild stroke. He recovered, would live another 16 years, but the stroke was a reminder of his mortality. Susan felt nothing. Not relief, not anger, not vindication. Just a strange emptiness where complex feelings about Moon had lived for 2 decades. 30 years after the deprogramming, Susan attended Ted Patrick's funeral. He died at 88, his legacy still debated, still controversial, still impossible to summarize. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he'd changed, for better and worse. Susan spoke at the funeral, talked about Ted as the man who'd kidnapped her from her wedding and the man who'd saved her life, as a criminal and a hero, as someone who'd violated her autonomy to restore her ability to make real choices. The legacy of Ted Patrick is that he did terrible things for good reasons, Susan said at the funeral. He kidnapped people, held them against their will, used psychological pressure that sometimes crossed into abuse, but he also saved lives, gave people their minds back, fought against organizations that destroyed families. Was he a hero? Yes. Was he a criminal? Also yes. Both things are true. And the fact that both things can be true is what makes his story, and mine, so complicated. 40 years after the deprogramming, Susan Elizabeth Hartley was 62 years old, retired from clinical practice, spending her time writing and speaking about cult psychology. Her parents had both passed away, Robert in 2008 and Margaret in 2013, both having lived long enough to see their daughter build a meaningful life. The question that defined Susan's adult life wasn't whether Ted Patrick was right to kidnap her or whether her parents were right to hire him. It was a deeper question about autonomy, manipulation, and the point where rescue becomes violation. When someone is so thoroughly programmed that they can't recognize manipulation, do others have the right to intervene against their will? Susan had spent 40 years thinking about that question, and she'd concluded that maybe there aren't clear answers. Maybe some ethical dilemmas exist in a gray zone where every choice has costs and every action has consequences, and the best you can do is make the choice that feels least bad and then live with the outcome. If this story made you think about autonomy, manipulation, and the price families pay when they fight to save their children from cults, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to Cult Exit for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about mind control, deprogramming, and the thin line between rescue and kidnapping. Comment below. Were Susan's parents right to kidnap her from her wedding? Where do you draw the line between saving someone and violating their rights? Because these stories aren't just history. Right now, somewhere, another family is watching their child join a high-control group. Another young person is being recruited through sophisticated manipulation techniques. Another set of parents is facing the same impossible decision the Hartley family faced on July 4th, 1976. Until next time, remember, sometimes the people who save your life are the same people who traumatize you. Sometimes the greatest act of love looks like the greatest betrayal. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking every law, and sometimes, 40 years later, you'll still be trying to figure out if it was worth it.